Welcome to the first in a new series of the Race F1 Tech Show, and there's no better time to start this particular series than just before the start of the 2026 season. We've had testing, we've seen the cars, we've got a good feel for what's going to go on and some of the challenges that may be faced, so the perfect time to look ahead to the year with a technical focus on it. So I'm Edd Straw, and far more importantly, back with me is Gary Anderson. Another season, Gary, and some pretty big changes for us all to get our heads around.
Yeah, it's another season. It's just around the corner whenever we'll kick off. And as we always say, we'll find out what's really happening when we get to Melbourne. But actually, it probably won't because there's so many changes this year with both the PU, the use of the PU and the chassis itself, obviously. Quite different characteristics for the car from the ground effect days to what we're calling now more of a flat bottom car. It'll still produce downforce from underneath it, but it's a reduced level. So, yeah, a lot for the teams to come to terms with. There was 9 days available, 3 in Barcelona for what was called the sort of pre-season shakedown. You run 3 days out of 5, and then Bahrain, 2 3-day tests, of which basically Bahrain was probably the first of the real pre-season testing when you can get down to sort of real hard setup changes or use of the characteristics of the car. So I think the progress made between day 1 in Bahrain to day 6 in Bahrain was fantastic, horrendous, really, to be honest. Some teams look like they're on top of it. Some teams not quite so much, I'm afraid. But in reality, what did sort of show up was that problems can pop up quickly. You've got to be very careful because we had teams running a horrendous amount of laps and then suddenly stop. Something went wrong. We're not privy to all the things that went wrong all the time, but we do know when the car doesn't come out of the garage for a while and the screens are up, they're doing something in there. So, yeah, all the problems are not over yet, but at least the cars are now in a state where they are drivable, and it looks from the last starts that you can sort of just about get off the start line.
Yeah, having been there throughout the Bahrain tests, you're absolutely right. A lot of progress was made with all of those cars. So we learned a reasonable amount. We're going to try and divide the podcast up into, first we'll talk about the cars specifically, and then we'll get into, in part two, the energy side of things, although inevitably there'll be a little bit of cross-pollination, as it were. So, Gary, now we've had all the launches and testing, we know as much as we're going to heading into the Australian Grand Prix. So just as a general question, who would your money be on heading to Melbourne?
Well, I think we've got to look at it, the big four, still the big four. That's Mercedes, Ferrari, Red Bull and McLaren. Are the others closer? Maybe not. Maybe the gap's bigger to the next batch of cars. And then, as I say, there's probably another 4 teams. And then there's 2 teams that look as though they're hanging off the back by their sort of fingertips a little bit. Nothing wrong with that. I mean, it is, you got to get the run and you got to get yourself sorted out. But taking those 4 top teams at the minute, I think that, what I saw from the Bahrain test was Charles Leclerc and the Ferrari definitely were wringing its neck on that last day to try and drag a lap time out of it. We don't know the fuel loads. We don't know the engine modes. But the effort level he was putting in, I don't think there was much left on the sandbagging. I think it was there. He used a lot of new tyres near the end to try and show the lap time, because I think they need to go back to Italy saying, look, here we are. But remember, this is only testing. Circuits, the characteristics of these cars, every circuit's going to be really important because they're all different. That's the problem. You can have your Mr. Average track, and Bahrain probably isn't one of them. So, you just need to make sure you can get the best out of it everywhere. But Ferrari did show that the car was drivable, and it did a competitive lap time relative to the old cars, etc., etc. And the reliability was, in general, very good. So would I put them first? Probably not quite, because although they won the Bahrain testing, I don't think they overall were the best car for Mr. Average circuit. I think Mercedes probably have a pretty good handle on it. George Russell's ripe for his stage in his career to show the maturity to lead the team, consistency of that maturity to lead the team. Kimi Antonelli is going to be biting at his heels because he is a quick little driver. So George has to be honest about it all. And I think the car and the power unit, I'm not sure that they have really shown the true power unit potential yet. I'm sure they were turned down a little bit more than probably Ferrari were. And McLaren are probably in the same boat because they use the same Mercedes power unit package. Red Bull were a bit of a surprise. I don't think they've shown their true potential yet either. Max Verstappen was pretty critical that these cars aren't a car for a race driver. They're a car for a bit of a taxi ride, I suppose you might call it. You got to look after so much now. Before it was just, you had to look after the mechanical bits of the car, just make sure you weren't abusing the car, and look after the tyres to get them to as far as you can in your stint without them dropping off, degradation-wise. But he's pretty critical about all of it now because you're driving everything. You're driving the heat into the battery from recharge, from usage. You're looking after everything and doing the best you can with it. So I think he was verbally critical about it all more than anybody else. Rightly or wrongly, I haven't driven one of them. I don't know really in detail enough about all that. All I know is that it's a pretty confusing system for the team and for the driver. Going back after the next 4 teams, I suppose Haas would come out top of that bunch, probably. They looked as though they were in quite decent control. They're definitely a more professional operation now than they were a few years ago, in the fact that they're, engineering led, I suppose, more, and positively led from the direction that they're going in. They have a vision and they're heading there, and they're doing a very good job. There's a lot of laps, they did race simulations, they were decently quick. Their competition is, as I say, the next 4 teams, not the top 4, to be honest. Start the season at the top of that next 4 from 5th team downwards, and keep yourself there. Then you can try and take the next step. So don't try and dream before you get the reality right. And as for Williams, it looks as though their car's a bit overweight, or everybody says it's a bit overweight, and that's just a time deficit. You can't have that, and it doesn't look great on the track. It's a lot of brake locking, a lot of sort of nasty little characteristics that don't just bode well for the driver to be able to drive consistently. RB2, the ex-Toro Rosso, or whatever you like to call them, again, they're in there somewhere in that bunch. And I think they'll have good days and bad days, but it's time for Lawson to show his true team leadership skill, because it's always difficult to lead a team unless the driver really does that. So he's got to get his act together there. And Alpine have made a big step. For sure, they're now using the Mercedes engine, which is a big step for them because we've always complained about power. But their car looks a lot better than their car looked in the past. I think it's more driver friendly. Still not, in my book, got the downforce levels probably the other ones have. So I think those 4 will be a mix and match depending upon the characteristics of the circuit and etc. And then we really go back to, and unfortunately I have to say, Cadillac, which, my book would be the 10th team at the minute. And that would be well done because they're a brand new team setting up from the beginning. They do have the benefit of a Ferrari, engine package, power unit package. So that's good for them. They don't use as far as I know, they don't use the Ferrari gearbox. They're using their own gearbox, but I'm not 100% sure of that one. But anyway, they've got the benefit of the Ferrari package, power unit package, but they do look as though they lack, quite a lot of downforce and still quite a lot of understanding. So they're a new team. I suppose a dismal one out of the whole test would be Aston Martin. They never got anything right, I suppose you might call it. Theirs is the most interesting car. Now, interesting cars are great as long as it functions and produces a lap time. I've been there myself. It made cars look different, but they didn't go any quicker. So sometimes it's better to just stick with what you know and don't try to get too excited about making it different. But they'll learn a lot. But once you've got a problem like I believe they have with battery temperatures and recharge and usage of the battery pack, that's again something that it's just like a light switch. It can work for you, and then suddenly it's gone off. It's not as though you can turn everything down a bit and still be competitive with that package. You need to sort of be really, really careful. So I think these first races are going to be soul searching for the Aston Martin team, but you never know. Overnight they can find that eureka moment, but I haven't seen it appear in testing yet.
Yeah, and you wrote a good piece for the race website that I'd recommend everyone has a look for. It's Gary Anderson, Test Disaster is the Kick Honda Needed, which draws on some of your experience working with Honda and a few parallels and what may happen now there. So let's talk about the car specifically, setting the power units aside for now. They're a little bit shorter, 20 centimetres shorter wheelbase, 10 centimetres narrower. They're a little bit lighter, about 30 kilos. They did look a bit sharper and a bit more responsive on turning, which was good. Drivers kept saying they were more agile. What did you make of that side of things? Because actually, I think the cars in isolation are probably a step forward from last year, aren't they? Just in terms of what they look like and their spectacle, etc.
Yeah, I think aesthetically, without doubt, just that small change on the tyre sizes, the track width, the wheelbase shorty, just the rear wing detail, the layout, they all look aesthetically more pleasing to the eye. And that's nice because, I think, as I used to say to the mechanics, the thing is about the car, I used to say to the designers, the thing about the car is if it looks good, it looks decent, the mechanics will put another coat of polish on it before they put the cover on it. If it doesn't look very good, they won't bother. They'll just stick the cover on it because they don't like it either. So make it look good, whatever you're doing. So I think, yes, aesthetically, the regulations have reached a certain area where they've made the car look a bit better. I'm not completely happy that the front wing end plates look better. I think that big foot plate on that central turning vane could have been thought about a little bit more. Does it need to be there for the size it is? No, it would be the same for everybody if it was 5 centimeters narrower, and that would make a big difference to accidents and incidents. Let's say, especially at the first corner of a Grand Prix, and the bargeboards, as we call them, or the whatever you like to call the vanes behind the front wheels. Again, they look. I think
floorboards is what we have to call them now. That's what they are in the regs. Yeah. Bargeboards is the phrase to use because people know what that's pointing to, don't they? I think just because something's technically called something doesn't mean you confuse fans. So I think bargeboards is the right word to use just for people know what they're looking for. That's
what the FIA are pretty good at, confusing everybody by calling something that we all know is something different.
Hey, it's not an acronym. It's not an abbreviation. So that's a win.
Yeah. Well, I've got floorboards in my house, and they don't look like those floorboards. But I had a bargeboard on my barge that I had for years, and it looked like that. So let's call them bargeboards. Yeah, I mean, I think, again, they are stuck out there in the middle of nowhere. The intention with them was to pick up the wake of the front tyre and shuffle it inboard underneath your own car, basically. So your turbulent wake from behind the front tyre made your own car suffer rather than the car that's trying to overtake you potentially or follow you suffer. But a couple of people at the FIA coming up with bright ideas, combating 1,000 people within the teams coming up with good ideas. You're never going to win. It's like going to a football match with, one team having 11 players and one team having one. It's probably not going to win that match, and that's exactly what Formula One is. It's the same deal. You're probably not going to win that competition of technical genius part. But again, from my point of view, a lot of these things are easy to fix. You just got to have the will to fix them and do something with them. And once you see these bits and how the teams have done something with them, it's then in the interest of the FIA to step in and do something. The teams will not agree to those changes because the teams have a big voice. But at the end of the day, what's this all about? It's about creating close competition for everybody. So those are the two bits of the cars that I think I would attack pretty quickly to change, because A, they'll be more resilient, as I say, on the first lap, first corner, as far as it not getting knocked off. But the rest of the car looks fine, so it's quite interesting. If you start to go through the regulations and lay out where everything can be, the regulations are an absolute nightmare, and you do need all these people within each team to actually understand them and just see the grey areas between X, Y, and Z coordinates. And never mind the regulations being an absolute nightmare. In my book, they're really badly laid out. Everything is, as I say, more or less X, Y, Z coordinates through the car. You create these boxes where things can be. And there is no individual table that takes you right through the car. would be so easy to create a table that just relates to the reference for each one and where they are in X, Y, Z, all the way through the car from front to back. Forget about whether it's front wing, rear wing. You can headline that with each column or each row as such, and then your columns are just X, Y, and Z coordinates. And it'd be so much easier to go through that and lay out the boxes that your car can be designed within, I suppose you might call it. But they're all over the place, and that makes it doubly difficult then. So, you've got to have lots and lots of people going through it to try and get the best out of it. And some teams will be better at it than others. That doesn't mean they're lesser teams, but it's just the fact that you just need so many people now doing it, and that's why the teams have got 1,000, 1,200, 1,500 people. It's just you need that amount of people.
One of the things we did see in testing is there is some decent room for innovation in these regs. Now, I know early on in a rule cycle you do expect that. We saw that last time round, and then they converged. But as well as what you might call the general aerogeometry differences that you get from car to car, which are quite dramatic. If you line up the Aston Martin against the Cadillac, say, those are very different cars. But we also saw a number of interesting innovations. You had what I like to call the flip-top rear wing for Ferrari that briefly ran on one of the days in the second test. Sadly, I didn't see that one with my own eyes because it didn't go out very much. So as soon as I heard it was there, I dived out, but the Ferrari disappeared for a few hours after that. And plus we saw their kind of flow conditioner, for want of a better word, towards the back of the car. We saw Mercedes with, I think you kind of christened it a fourth element in the rear wing. So lots of little things that cropped up that made you look at it and go, oh, that's interesting. What's going on there? Which I think is quite encouraging, given there was so much concern about every time the new regs come out, they're more prescriptive, aren't they? So interesting that there were a number of devices that turned up that made you go, oh. So what did you make of those? Which one do you think was probably the most interesting of those, or anything else you saw?
Yeah, I think, the innovative one obviously was that Ferrari's rear wing flipping. It's the rear flaps overboard. I did a little bit on it, and as I say, looking at them all, there's four different styles, really, I suppose you could call it. There is what we know as the DRS option, which pivots the rear wing, two rear wing. And instead of being two flaps now, there are two elements for the rear wing, a main plane and a flap. You have now got potentially three elements. Although it is still two, it's a main plane and two flaps that have to be rigidly connected. So at the end of the day, they've gone to that level of having the three elements because they wanted the flow to reattach on the flaps quicker and more consistently than it would on one flap, because obviously the flow reattachment is important if you're going to be using that as a straight line mode, which is obviously a drag reduced mode. So your rear wing assembly now is all about, when it's in cornering mode, maximum downforce. Don't worry too much about the drag, so the efficiency is not important. And when you open it, it's minimum drag, and don't worry too much about the downforce. So you've got two extremes on that rear wing to address to try to get the best out of it. There is four solutions that we've seen so far. I'm just about trying to create a fifth solution that I think I might have looked at myself. I don't know whether it's legal or not, but I'll put that into a column later on. So the four solutions are that I think it's 8 teams have more or less followed the DRS route of pivoting the flap upwards around the trailing edge. Before in DRS, there was a minimum slot gap and a maximum slot gap. Now you don't have a maximum slot gap. There's still a minimum slot gap. You don't have a maximum slot gap, so you can open it more if you want to, because they're now called cornering mode, maximum downforce, straight line mode, minimum drag. The Audi pivots itself in the middle of the two flaps, so they rotate it. It drops down and the trailing edge drops down and the leading edge raises up. So they sort of, do a bit of both. That in itself will probably keep the flow attached to the main plane. The slot gap will become much bigger to the main plane, but you're still getting effective flow coming off the flaps that will talk to the main plane, I suppose you might call it. So it might not be as big a drag reduction as you'd want. The Alpine solution is to drop it down around the leading edge of the two flaps. So they reduce the frontal area, they reduce the complete camber of the complete wing assembly, allowing it to still produce a little bit of downforce. So it's not the end of the world as far as reattachment. It probably is better than the others. And my little simulation says that's actually one of the most efficient ways of doing it, because you still got a wing controlling the wake coming off the trailing edge of it. It's still connected to all three elements. So you're not discarding the main plane and leaving it there with a huge slot gap. That means the two of them are working independently. And then there was the Ferrari one, which caught us all by surprise, pivoted again on the trailing edge, opening up completely and flipping over backwards. Now, I have to say that I assume that the regulations, and this is why I've been through them in quite detail, the regulations allow you to do whatever you want to do whenever the wing is going from cornering mode to straight line mode, because at some points in time, obviously that wing flap becomes illegal because it's right up in the air. The benefit of flipping it over backwards, it will bring the wake downwards there. So the wake coming down, the leading edge of the wing disappears, etc. But you'll have probably a gurdy flap on it anyway, which will act a bit like a leading edge, and the flow will build up around that to make a sort of stagnation point. And the flow coming off that will then meet up with the flow coming off the main plane and probably help each other out a little bit, so they're not as wake dependent. But it's you need a wind tunnel to sort this stuff out, or at least a very, very complex CFD model. The thing I see positive about the Ferrari, or I believe it would be positive, is on the way back again from that reverse upside down position, it goes through that cycle of standing vertically, which will offer a huge amount of drag at the back of the car, like a parachute. So when you're braking, for that, it's 400 milliseconds you've got from one position to another position maximum. That 400 milliseconds, let's say, half a second nearly, whenever you're braking for a maximum of like 1 second, over 100 meters, going into a corner, 1 and a little bit seconds, that 400 milliseconds is a big percentage of that. So, the drag effect there will be beneficial for sure in slowing the car down aerodynamically before you have to hit the brake pedal. So there could be benefits in that area as well. So to me, that was the biggest thing I saw. But they're small detail of the turning vanes that they've got around the rear crash box to extend the diffuser, etc. You're allowed a certain width there, mainly for the rear wing pillars, but you're allowed a certain width there, which you can do sort of anything within. And we've seen through the years many people had turning vanes between the wing pillars, little small turning vanes, etc. So they've exploited it quite a bit. I'm not sure again about the top one they had, the top turning vane, which blanks off the exhaust system a little bit, because you don't really want to interfere too much with the exhaust flow. They be interesting to see, because you're allowed 2 different sizes of exhaust, or you're allowed a window of exhaust diameter, exhaust outlet diameter. I'm not sure whether they have as big as possible or as small as possible. As big as possible will reduce the back pressure on the turbo, but as small as possible will increase the flow velocity coming out of it. If they had the smallest one, had that little wing in there, I would say they're trying to get the exhaust gas flow velocity to help the diffuser work in that central section, because of what we call exhaust blowing. You get less exhaust blowing if you have bigger diameter exhaust. You do with smaller diameter exhaust, mainly because you're using the exhaust velocity to help the downforce level. As we all know, that speed is relative to downforce. So the faster you can flow the airflow over a surface, the more downforce you'll get. Whether that's coming from the exhaust or coming from just airspeed is immaterial. It still will create a load force in it. So, good innovations. As you say, it's early days, and we'll see a lot more coming quite soon. And we're seeing big enough innovations, I think, to see how this all, who heads in the right direction and who heads in whose direction, I suppose, is the best thing.
Right, let's get on to the big question now, Gary, which is how the energy regimes will play out on the various circuits. Lots of criticism of elements of this from some drivers, notably Max Verstappen, who I think it's fair to say some of his criticisms are shared privately by a few of the drivers who are being more on message, shall we say. But what do you make of this situation with the harvesting, the deployment, and the challenge that everybody's facing on this?
What do I make of it? Not a lot, I suppose is the best way of putting it, because, I look at motor racing from the outside now. I'm obviously from the engineering side and from the design side of Formula One. I hope I understand a reasonable amount of it. But I know that what I'm watching now, I can relate to what I see visually as being a racing car. I can't relate anything to what is done in secret squirrel mode underneath the car. So whenever the drivers are using, different strategies, etc., it's all invisible. It's not there for the enthusiast, the viewer, even somebody who's involved with it like myself to actually physically see why a car is potentially quicker than another car. It could just be, I'll just overtake him, done, end of story. Why? How did that happen? I have no idea. So I don't like that sort of stuff. We in reality, I don't think any of us have ever really seen in detail what's underneath the engine cover of a Formula One car currently, the layout of the package, anything like that. We only see what we see on the racetrack in detail with the bodywork on the car. So that's all we can relate to. So I hate to see a formula where basically it's all about the hidden, about performance, etc. I want to see somebody change the front wing and go a second faster because they've tested a new front wing that's got this trick X, Y, Z, whatever. So as I say, I don't understand why we got to this point now. And the balancing act between straight line speed, the use of engine or electrical torque, it's all just too complicated. I believe it's too complicated for the teams. It's too complicated for the drivers. Obviously, some will get it right, and that's why we say there's the big four. The big four just have more manpower to actually sort of look at all this stuff. But that's all manpower taken away from the visual effect of the days when Nigel Mansell was sliding through a corner, 300 kilometers an hour with a bit of opposite lock on, nothing coming off the tires but smoke. Those are all gone those days. Yes, these cars now look as though they can be driven in a slide and the driver can catch it again. The old cars had so much grip, they were just too snappy. But that's lovely. That's visual. You can see that when a driver gets the car a bit sideways, a bit of opposite lock on, but still keeps going in the same direction. That's great. But as far as the engine's concerned, different maps, did driver B use map 43 instead of map 41 on that lap? Is that why he's got more power? It's all invisible stuff. So I don't like the way it is at the moment.
Well, and you've even got mechanisms in terms of that energy regime that are kind of algorithmic and automated, and there's a self-learning system based on distance. And some drivers were saying, well, you do basically the same lap twice, but it's different because there's subtle differences in the harvesting, and that changes the deployment and all sorts of things. But I mean, in broad terms, the key numbers you have to remember are 350 kilowatt motor, so that's 469 brake horsepower. You've got effectively a 4 megajoule battery, but that's dictated by the difference between maximum and minimum charge anytime you're on track. So, for example, you could have a bigger battery, but there's a certain window you're in. You can harvest on a normal track 8.5 megajoules per lap. So you're constantly discharging and charging the battery to make it work. So those are the sort of big numbers that everybody's working within. And then you've got all these ways of doing it. You've got the regeneration under braking. You've got super clipping, which is when you're on 100% throttle, but you've got the MGU-H in full charge mode. So you've got this big anchor slowing the car down effectively. Part throttle charging, you've got lift and coast charging. So those are your 4 main modes, but braking is your number one. And that's why certain circuits, Australia is one of them, are really problematic, because if you don't have that much braking, you haven't got much opportunity to harvest. So that's the big challenge we'll be seeing in Australia. Bahrain, it wasn't too bad. You need quite a lot of deployments in Bahrain, but the charging opportunities is actually one of the better tracks in terms of the braking charging. So those are the big numbers. Shall we work through some questions now, Gary? Because we've got various questions from listeners and members of the Race Members Club that cover aspects of this, and we'll go through those and see where we get to in terms of the ground covered, because there's so many dimensions to this, and there's areas where you can really get into the weeds of it, and there's also areas where you can just stray into just well beyond the available knowledge, particularly seeing as quite a bit of this is actually private. You look in the regs and there's, refer to this document, none of which are public. But anyway, let's dive into some questions though. So Gareth Anstey says, is there a reason the electric drive doesn't enable until a certain speed, given you think 0 to 50 kilometres per hour is the ideal time to use it? Now, this, just to add detail, that's about the starts from the grid. You can't deploy electrical energy until electrical power until you get to 50 kilometres per hour. So why?
Well, again, I think it's done partly to reduce the chance of a team coming up with a way of using that 0 to 50 or the electrical power's traction control off the grid. Because, obviously, if you're looking at something, you'd have to look at front wheel speed to see whether the car is doing 50 Ks. It's if you look at rear wheel speed, it could be doing 50 Ks instantly. So you'd be looking at front wheel speed to determine that 50 kilometers an hour. I don't agree with it. I think it should be there from the beginning, and it should be a fixed ramp relative to car speed. So in other words, every 10 Ks you get X amount more power. Instead of just a light switch putting the power on and off, it would be like a dimmer switch. So for that initial 0 to 50 Ks, let's say you could have 50 kilowatts available to you, or a number that will mean that you wouldn't necessarily make a great start, but you wouldn't be stalled on the start line. The car would still get off the start line if you didn't get the turbo speed and all that stuff up to speed. Because at the moment you're relying on the driver being on the throttle, on the grid, working against the MGU-K. So the MGU-K is holding the engine back. The driver's on the throttle, so your ICE, internal combustion engine, is making power and using it up relative to that harvesting that the MGU-K is doing while the car is sitting stationary. So you need to have capacity in the battery for the amount you're going to charge it. We see the drivers sitting for like 10 seconds or something on quite a high RPM. That's to get the turbo speed up, but at the same time, you would only have like maybe 5% throttle to get 11,000 RPM if you didn't have that motor holding the engine back. So because the motor's holding the engine back, you need probably 50-60% throttle to get the 10 or 11,000 RPM that they're using. So you're charging the battery up at the same time. So you've got to have room in the battery when you get to the start-finish line to allow that to happen. The reason you're on the throttle is because you want to get the turbo speed up, because you don't have enough power to get that massive car, that weight of car off the start-finish line efficiently. If you don't have as much power as the engine will give you, and it won't have as much power as the engine will give you if you don't have a turbo boost pressure. So it's a circle of events that a slight change in the regulations to allow X amount of electrical power to be there up to 50 Ks, say 50 kilowatts. And then from there on in, you ramp the power up instead of being like a light switch. So in effect, that ramp, until you get to the maximum power, that ramp will halve the power usage to that point. And that ramp, whatever, can be the same for everybody. And as I say, there's 350 kilowatts available from the electrical motor. That's the level you would change from different circuits. Whenever you can't harvest enough for all the different circuits, you would just alter that maximum level that the electric motor can produce. So there's ways and means, I think, of sorting everything out. But as far as the start line is concerned, getting off the start line, I would immediately have an electrical level that was enough to get the car off the grid, as opposed to it stopping and somebody ramming you from the back. All the start line tests were done in Bahrain with leaving a grid position open. I don't think they're going to do that in Melbourne. But, it's one of those things, whenever the cars get to within their normal grid position, there's not much gap between you and the car in front to react if somebody does have a problem and stalls the engine. So, safety-wise, I think that a bit of electrical power to begin would be safer for everybody and be more interesting. Yes, you might still make a bad start, but so be it.
Now, during that excellent answer, there was definitely some objection from the dog on that, I thought I heard in the background, which I think sums up some people's feelings about the complexity of these engines and the challenge of understanding it. But
the dog was having a little moan, like me.
I think there'll be a few F1 fans making similar noises while trying to get their heads around what's going on in Australia. But anyway, let's move on to a question now from Josh from Toronto. Currently, my understanding is, as a car exits the corner, the ICE and electric motor propels the car down the straights. As the battery depletes, the electric motor isn't producing anything and the ICE has taken over 100%. At this stage, is the electric motor freewheeling, similar to being clutched out, or does it start harvesting any time it isn't depleting? Or do the teams choose when the motor starts harvesting, be that via clipping or lift and coast?
Well, it's a bit of both, really. Obviously, you've got battery power that can drive that electric motor. That electric motor is coupled directly to the engine, and it's gear-driven, so the RPM of the motor and the RPM of the engine can be different, but the torque from it is going directly through the crankshaft, through the gearbox, out to the rear wheels. When you run out of that battery power, then you can just simply use the internal combustion engine to power the car as far as the rest of the straight is concerned, and not do anything with the motor. But that will be a big deficit anyway, because obviously the power's like more or less halved. The overall power of the car is halved because it's supposed to be a 50-50 power split. So the driver can choose, a team can choose if that's an area of the track where you're better to recharge a little bit of the battery. But if you do start to recharge a little bit of the battery, that will reduce your internal combustion engine power, because it's that that's driving the electric motor. So not only will you be slower on the straight, you'll also take away speed on that bit of the straight. So you normally would wait till you want to slow down, and then you would do a lot of your slowing by using the electric motor to harvest energy, to put the battery back into position. On the rear axle is the only harvesting you have. So really that means electrical braking on the rear of the car and hydraulic braking on the front of the car, which again is no easy feat to balance. And we've seen that with the cars locking up a lot. Getting the balance between those two is pretty difficult, because one can be instantaneous, electrical power, for example. The second one takes time for the brake pressure to build up. You're only talking milliseconds here, but it's still, to a racing driver who's doing 300 kilometers, a few milliseconds is like a lifetime. So getting that balance all correct is quite difficult. The problem is that you've got two scenarios that a racing car has to power its way through. One is qualifying, when you've just done a slow lap, you've done all the harvesting you can, you arrive at the start-finish line with the battery pack in the best possible condition for that lap, and then off you go. You will still harvest during braking with the motor, but you will try to get a combination of setup that means you're not running out of power at the wrong time down the straight. You're able to maximize what you're allowed to do with the power levels and the speed that you're allowed to do. So you've got to balance that for a qualifying lap to try to get the best lap time out of the car. And then you go to a race, which is completely different. All you're interested in doing is having enough battery power to overtake someone or to defend against someone. And you don't have the luxury of doing a slow lap and charging everything up and then doing a quick lap. That luxury is not there, because the end result, as you do a 10, 15, 20 lap stint, you've got to average out your lap time over that stint length to try to get the best out of it possible. So between qualifying and the race, currently, a much bigger different solution to what we had last year. So teams are going to have to scratch their own heads and burn a bit of midnight oil once they sort of understand what that circuit requires.
Yeah, and there's some big questions about how difficult that's going to be with just 3 free practice sessions in Australia, let alone when we go to China and it's just 1 practice session before you're into sprint qualifying. Right, a question from Nevin Knowles. How much would the issue with harvesting energy have been resolved if they were able to harvest using the front brakes as well? And Rich Snape asked if that idea could return. So currently you can only harvest off the rear axle, so why not the front axle, Gary?
Well, I asked that question myself many, many times. So I don't really understand, because
it's because Audi might be a bit too good at it. I think that was the main concern everybody had, given their experience from sports cars. I think it's as simple as that, competitive self-interest.
Yeah, it can be, but you got to look at the bigger picture. There's, let's put it like this, so maybe reasons that it would be problematic as well, because, as I say, at the moment on the average circuit as we have put together on a column we did a while back, the average circuit, the driver is looking for maximum power for something like 60 seconds of a lap time. And they are braking for something like 12 seconds of a lap time. So as I said earlier on, the harvesting that we have at the moment is twice that potential battery package unit. So you're allowed 4 megajoules, as you said at the beginning of this, you're allowed 4 megajoules of energy from top to bottom at any one point in time. So let's say that's on a straight, that you're normally, the longest straight I think we see is about 28 seconds when it's full throttle. So let's say Mr. Average is about 20 seconds, just for a rough guide. So you could use 4 megajoules for 20 seconds going down a straight. At the end of that straight, you get a big braking and a hairpin. And during that period, you can charge at 8 megajoules, 8.5 megajoules. So, but you're only on the brakes for like a second, maybe 1.5 seconds at that type of braking episode. So there's no way you can put back everything that you've taken out of it. So it's a compromise around the lap. So yes, if you went to electric motors in the front axles, they don't have to be connected with a drive shaft or anything. They can be individual. They can function in one direction only, so you can't create 4-wheel drive. They can only harvest energy. That would mean that 8.5 megajoules could go up. But then what you've got to look at is what can the battery cope with as far as firing energy into it and dissipate in heat, because you've got to get rid of all that stuff. So there may be a complication there. But as you say, Audi probably had more of a handle on it than most others. But it's just one of those sort of things where I think they missed the boat by not going to at least something from the front wheels. You don't have to have lots, but once you've got something, then as the years go by, you can exploit it a bit further. Starting having from nothing to something is limited, and it'll be head scratching. But once you've got something, then as I say, you can maximize it. And I think they missed the boat in doing that. I wouldn't be surprised to see it coming in later on, but I think they should have done it. And as I say, suffered all the other consequences and tried to got a system that will function. And then, as I say, you can upgrade that system as time goes by through the years that they're going to have these regulations for.
Next up, a question from Paul R., who says, instead of slowing down to maximise energy recovery, is it possible for drivers to work out an optimal level of battery power and not often coast as much, so that over a lap they are quicker but not as fast as others on the straight?
Yeah, that's the balancing act, Paul. I mean, it's just about simulation for the best lap time. All the simulation tools now will have been rehashed to take into account that you're going to have to do this. It's power usage and power and harvesting levels, and your best lap time will be around that compliance. The big problem is if somebody else isn't doing the same as you, then you need to have something left there to retaliate against the driver who's going to try and overtake you. So it's one of those sort of things. It's the race that matters. It's the overall race time that matters. Usually, if you're the fastest race time, you come out in front. But during that period, on each lap, there may be an opportunity for somebody else who's not going as fast as you to overtake. So you've got to have that little cushion left in the system, so that when you need to use it, there are a couple of parameters which again is difficult to understand. The boost button you can use if you're within a second of the car in front of you. I think it's called the boost button. If you're within a second of the car in front of you coming up to the start-finish line, you can actually use it for the whole lap or parts of the lap if you've got the energy in the battery. So it's still doing whatever you do with it. It's still all about managing the energy you have left in the battery. It's like you're going down a motorway or down a road, and you're running a little bit low on fuel. Do you go faster and try and get there quicker? Or do you go slower and try and save some fuel just in case that fuel station's shut and you have to go to the next one? It's the same with this thing. You're driving all the time knowing that you've got to get to that fuel station to get fuel in it. So you've got to get to that harvesting point, you've got to harvest enough. Or once you see the fuel station up ahead, then you think, I can make that. So down goes the throttle pedal and away you go, So it's a balancing act, and the whole lap will be about a balancing act. And the thing for me, as I said earlier, it's the difference between qualifying and the race. It's a completely different environment.
And the final question for this section is from Switch GP7, who says, if Red Bull Ford powertrains really do have a 1 second advantage through deployment on the straights like Toto Wolff claims, how could Red Bull pull something like that off on their first attempt at making an engine? And how could established manufacturers like Ferrari or Mercedes fall so far behind?
Well, yes, we don't know if they have that. I mean, the teams are obviously playing politics with saying how they've X, Y, Z's got different characteristics from doing this great thing. 1 second a lap seems a lot. I didn't see it really used much after probably the first couple of days when everybody got excited about the Red Bull performance. What you've got to remember is that although Red Bull were using, let's say, Honda engines for the last few years, they were being built and run from Red Bull technologies. So Red Bull technologies have had a serious input into the last couple of years of Formula One engines. So they're not like starting from nothing. They're starting from a fairly known foothold. So it's one of these things. If their simulation tools are better than other simulation tools at working out exactly where you want that power and where you want to harvest it, where you want to use it at, then fine. They may be a second a lap quicker down the straight. But as an overall lap time, it's still going to be down to the balancing out of power usage against power harvesting. And that, as I say, is the beginning of this really, for me, is the thing it's blind. To any viewer, enthusiast, everybody, it's just blind. You don't know what's going on. There's nothing on the screen that tells you, at this point in time anyway, nothing on the screen that tells you the driver's on the boost button or he's on the overtake button or he's doing anything really. You can see the wings opening and closing, but once again, it would be nice to have something beside the driver to say, his car's not on TV, but he's got his wings open at the moment. So there's lots of things I think where the graphics will have to come into play as time goes by. But I think for this first part of the season, let's just accept the fact we're just going to be as confused as hell about it all.
I think, incidentally, on Red Bull powertrains, one of the things that they have appeared to have done is they're very, very much taking that Red Bull team culture of being super aggressive on the power unit design approach. And I think there's a slightly higher tolerance for allowing unreliability in pursuit of performance, and then you can prove the reliability. That does seem to be the slight culture thing that they've got going on there. But I think answering those questions has given a reasonable analysis of the energy regime. So I'm sure people have got many, many more questions, but there's so many dimensions, aren't there? Yeah,
there's so many dimensions. Just one thing I'd like to add in there that I never really addressed, whatever we were talking about off the start line, and this turbo, the requirement for the drivers to put 10, 11,000 RPM on the engine to get the turbo speed up. And the fact that Ferrari seem to have an advantage in that area with what's called smaller turbo. The thing about this is that, all of the PU manufacturers, all of the teams even, will know how much electrical energy they used last year driving the MGU-H to get that turbo up to speed for the start line, because last year it was invisible, but you had the electric motor on the turbo. So they will know how much they had to do that on the start line for their given turbo size. And I'm surprised that some PU manufacturers don't seem to have looked at that at all. Or even car constructors haven't looked at that at all. Ferrari, if they've done this because they've actually, looked at it all and said, this is what we need, then fantastic, pat on the back to them all. If it's just because their philosophy is running the smaller turbo, which it has been for the last few years, and by luck, it's ended up helping them off the start-finish line, then that's fine, that's okay. But as I say, it's interesting the other teams didn't have a look at it, because if you've got the big turbo, you need to run higher RPM to get the exhaust flow and get the turbo speed up. So it's a pat on the back to Ferrari if they actually did it because of knowledge. And also a little bit of a pat on the back if they did it because accidentally, because that's what their philosophy is anyway. So it'd be interesting to see who heads down a different route soon and tries to find some solution to that. But that's why I say the electrical energy, having something there would patch in that need for the engine, the power to all have to come from the internal combustion engine, which would mean on the start line it would be safer. But Ferrari's never going to agree to that if they've got an advantage, because that's just a black and white, isn't it? I wouldn't.
I think it's also going to make the start in Australia well worth watching. I suspect it'll be a little bit better in terms of the variation than you saw in some of those practice starts for various reasons. But we could see some good old school big position gains or losses, which, provided there aren't lots of cars literally stuck on the grid, actually is, I think, pretty good for the show.
Yeah, no, the start's everything, and I'll be watching it.
Right, for the final part of the podcast, we've got some questions that are a little bit more all over the place. If you do have a question for this podcast, send it through to podcasts@therace.com. That's podcasts@the-race.com. I have a suspicion there will be quite a few questions arising from the Australian Grand Prix, and we should be recording just after that. So, yeah, keep an eye on that weekend, and I'm sure there'll be plenty of things you'll want a little bit more on. But the first question, Gary, comes from Chris Westwood, who says, the new barge boards are very prominent, and apparently they are critical to the car's aero performance, but their size and position make them vulnerable to damage in close racing. Will we see teams using quick-release assemblies to replace them after an incident, similar to front wing assemblies?
Difficult to know whether it's of that sort of magnitude of value. I mean, back in the old days when the barge board was working really well for you, you could get about 15% more downforce out of the underfloor. That was a pair of barge boards. So let's say one might be worth 7.5%, but they're not as prominent and not as not as detailed as what they used to be in what they did. So they're probably less than that by a considerable amount. A barge board, I'd guess now, probably 3% or something like that. So would you just forget about it and drive on with it? If you lost the front wing, you can't, so you need to change the nose. If you lost the front wing end plate, you can, so you don't need to change the nose. And I think the barge board is just sort of part of that as well. I don't think you'll see them get quick release mechanisms just to be able to change the barge board, because it's just adding complication and weight to the car, and I don't think they need that.
Yeah, I haven't actually asked any teams about that, but I think you're right. Given the performance benefit has been bigger in the past, and they've not done that, I suspect not. But we're certainly going to see a few of those lying on the track at first corners this year, and I wouldn't be surprised to see at least one there in Australia. Right, a question from Jim Gross now, who says, can Gary give some insight into why the MGU-H wasn't more successful? For the entirety of the previous regulations, all we heard was how complicated and expensive the MGU-H was. But wheel nuts are complicated and expensive in Formula One, and putting an electric motor in line between the turbine and compressor feels like such a light bulb moment. It feels like the only road relevant thing Formula One has done in years. I would have expected every turbo inline four in the world to have an MGU-H by this point. What am I missing? Well, I guess the first thing was that the outside PU manufacturers didn't want to have to develop it, didn't they? That was the other side of the Audi thing. People didn't want Audi coming in with front axle recovery, and Audi didn't want to come in to an MGU-H world where they had to learn. So self-interest trumps all.
Yeah, well, Jim, I think it was a great idea personally, and I agree 100% with everything you said there. Because at the end of the day, we're seeing now how good the MGU-H was at maintaining decent turbo pressure. The whole philosophy of a turbo engine is you can get more power out of it than you can out of a normally aspirated engine of the same engine capacity. So I don't understand what's wrong with that. That's equivalent to a road car getting away from a roundabout or a set of traffic lights. My wife's got an electric car, and when I drive that, the power's instant. So when you pull out in a roundabout in front of somebody, or when you see somebody coming, but there's an awful gap, you hit the throttle pedal and away it goes. Whereas if you've got a small engined car, you hit the throttle pedal and it just doesn't work. And the turbo lag, if you've got a turbo on it, it just it's not instant. It's a bit like a driver getting off the start finish line. So if you have the MGU-H, you can patch that in, no matter whether it's a road car or a racing car. I have no idea why they threw it away. Once I got my head around the fact that it was called MGU-H, which motor generator unit heat, is a bit of a strange thing to call it, because it's nothing to do with the heat really. It's a motor generator unit that drives the turbo. So MGU-T would be quite good. It's a motor generator unit that you can drive the turbo with to get turbo up to speed, or more importantly, you can hold the turbo back from overspeeding or overboosting by making it work the opposite way around. And at that point in time, it creates power, which you can either use immediately, or you could either use immediately, or you could store up in the battery for later on. So it all had positives. As I say, I agree with you 100%. I think the wrong thing was throwing it away. And if it was done because Audi wanted to come and play, then you'd have said to Audi, well, don't bother. We don't want you to come and play if you don't want to meet with the rules that we've got. So, yes, I'm confused. I think it would be great. And I think you'll see it on road cars, quite a lot of road cars. And I believe Audi actually have a road car now with an MGU-H on it to drive the turbo.
Yeah, it would have made a lot of sense, I think, to have the MGU-H, given the energy situation. Actually, the question says it wasn't a success. I think the MGU-H was a success, as you've laid out, Gary, and I think it's a shame it's been lost. Right, Sebastiano Russo says, this is maybe a very simple and basic question, but you always say that all questions are welcome, so here it is. Well, they certainly are welcome, and I think sometimes simple questions come up with the most interesting answers. So, the question continues. With the lowering of the weight limit, we often hear that reducing the car weight is free lap time. It's something I've always heard in the 30 plus years I followed F1, so no great news. But my question is, it's widely known that 10 kilos of weight amounts to around 0.3 of a second of lap time. But does where you lose weight influence how much you gain? If you lose weight from higher up on your car, thus reducing the centre of gravity, would it net a bigger gain than losing weight closer to the ground? And can sometimes, in Gary's experience, losing weight on some parts of the car influence the handling of the car, thus decreasing the gain or even not gaining at all?
Yes, Sebastiano, it does make a difference. Let's just take basic things. You've got a centre of gravity of the car, the height of the centre of gravity, and you've got its weight distribution front to rear. So that creates a point in the middle of the car somewhere. Front to rear, you want that weight to be as close to that centre as possible. In other words, you can get the same weight distribution front to rear, and you can have it all hanging out the back or all having out the front. But the inertia would be there. So once the car broke away, the inertia would be huge. So the car would swap ends very, very quickly, even if it had the same weight distribution. So you want to try and put that weight as compact as possible between the wheels, so you reduce the inertia. As far as the centre of gravity height is concerned, if you can take 10 kilos from above it and even move it to the bottom of the car, to put it below the centre of gravity, the car will go faster because there's not the roll moment's reduced going through the corner because you've got a lower centre of gravity, which makes the car go faster. So then you look at it and you say, okay, if I can make the car 10 kilograms, if the car's too heavy by 10 kilograms, and I take 10 kilograms off the car, but I leave the centre of gravity and the weight distribution the same, then that's when we say the car will go 0.3 of a second faster. So there's other ways of changing the lap time other than losing weight. If you take 10 kilograms away above the centre of gravity and the car was 10 kilograms overweight, then the car would go faster because it's 10 kilograms lighter, plus you get the benefit of lowering the centre of gravity that little bit as well. So that might add up to 0.4 of a second. So all of the bits of the jigsaw have to fit together. As I say, if you took 10 kilograms from underneath the centre of gravity and the car was 10 kilograms over the weight limit, then you would probably only go 0.2 of a second faster. So it's a bit of a round-up figure, that 0.3. But in general, that's what happens because you can't really change the centre of gravity that much on these cars. You can change the weight a bit, but that's an overall global thing. To save 10 kilograms is massive. You could change a lot of stuff. You can't just take something and throw it away. There isn't things on the car that you can just take and throw away. Or there's very few. Let's say. So 0.3 is a round figure that sort of is relative to overall weight, but keeping the CG and the weight distribution in a similar position.
And the final question now comes from Mary Stern, who says, would it be quicker if a car used a lift wing rather than a downforce wing? What are the trade-offs? I imagine lifting the car effectively makes it fly, hence the effective weight of the car diminishes and the car goes faster. It's half car, half plane.
Half car, half plane, yeah. Well, the thing to remember here is the tyres only get grip from load. There's a certain mass of the car weighs a certain amount. So basically, when you're going around a corner, if the vertical weight of the car and the lateral force of the car was the same, then you theoretically can corner at 1G or just above it because the tyre coefficient's better than 1. So then you apply the downforce on top of it. So if you had 3 times the aerodynamic load pushing the car into the ground, added to the weight of the car, that gives you a figure. And if the weight of the car creating the lateral load was the same, then you can theoretically go around the corner at 4G or slightly higher. So having lift on the car as a general thing, like an aeroplane, would mean that the tires wouldn't have any grip and you would fly, which is not really the best way of getting a lap time going around a racetrack. The thing about lift and downforce, which act in the opposite directions, is they both create drag. So, an aeroplane creates drag, even though it's flying in the sky, it creates an aerodynamic drag. And that's when you can look at it and you see a plane taking off or landing, when all the wing elements come out, that's because the speed they're traveling at, they need more lift to keep the car and the plane in the air or to lift the plane off the ground than they do whenever they're flying at higher speed. But as I say, that the lift or downforce will create drag, so it will hold the vehicle back, be it an airplane or a car. But you need the downforce on the racing car to create the tire grip. It takes you around the corner and or braking. It takes you around the corner or braking. So you can't really use lift. And that's the sort of compromise, what we call now with the straight line mode versus the cornering mode. That's what I say. In cornering mode, you want the maximum downforce, but in straight line mode, you want the minimum drag. You don't care about the downforce because the straight line mode is all straight line.
Well, as always, some great answers there and some excellent questions as well. If you'd like to join the question asking, remember it's podcasts@therace.com. That's podcasts@the-race.com. Now, we're going to be back after the Australian Grand Prix, as I mentioned, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of technical talk to dissect from there. So join us then for more from Gary.